microphone. So if you could make sure that you're on mute so we can't hear any background noise, that'd be very helpful. So this is the second in our series of webinars that we're organising for our members. And obviously, while we can't replace the interaction and the engagements that we enjoy at a physical ITCO meeting, the aim is to enable us to continue the progress of the 4 ITCO work groups that we established last year in Amsterdam. And as you know, today's topic is technical and regulations and standards. We ran the sustainability work group last month, and future webinars will cover safety and efficiency. Before introducing today's presenter, please let me just go through the rules of the webinar. So as with all ITCO meetings, participants must comply with the antitrust guidelines, and which means that there should be no discussion about rates or competition issues. All participants, as I mentioned, are asked to put their sound system on mute unless they are speaking. This is essential to reduce background noise. We have over 75 participants on the call today, or at least they registered to participate. And during the course of the presentation, we will open up the webinar for comments and questions. So if you want to speak, obviously unmute yourself. And it's useful if you can use the hand icon at the bottom of the screen. That's not essential, but it helps me to know that someone's trying to talk. And there's also a chat line function which enables you to write your question, and the message can be made public to all participants or privately just to me, whichever you prefer. Okay, so I'd now like to introduce our speaker today, who is Colin Rubery, ITCO Technical Secretary, who will make the presentation. Most of you know Colin. He's been involved in the tank container business for many, many years and has served as ITCO Technical Secretary for the past decade. He attends many regulatory, technical and standards meetings on behalf of ITCO. And of course, he writes the ITCO technical guidelines and the monthly technical report in the newsletter. And he is the convener of the ITCO technical and regulatory work group. So he'll be talking to you today. Colin, the floor is yours.
Okay, good morning, everybody, or good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. And thank you for joining. I hope we can get some interesting discussion going today. Well, we have an agenda, as you can see. We'll talk a little bit about technical guidance, some of the things that I'm doing and what I could help do your help with. And obviously we can talk about the regulations and some various comments thereafter. So let's move on to the first thing. We've been building up now almost a little library of technical guidance documents, which I hope is to support industry. I mean, there are two reasons for these, or as I understand it, as I see it, there are two reasons. Is that one is hopefully it's informative, but it also helps become a reference point when you're dealing with various clients, and particularly on things like polymerizing substances and so on, becomes a checklist of the items you like to look at. I'm always really looking for some feedback from everyone as to what other guidelines we would like to produce. We have, as you know, the tank e-learning, and that's a continuous updating of that, which I have been doing, and very recently just done some updates. We may have another look at ACC if there's any interest from your good selves, whether it needs a little bit of an update. It was done in 2016, so it's not so far behind. And one of the things we have proposed at the moment is to do in the next, immediately to get started on the safe end life disposal of and recycling of tank containers. I think that might be quite useful, but secondly, it comes with this campaign of about flexi tanks and recycling. Then it's probably a good idea, I suggest, that ITCO also gets its house in order and has a recycling and disposal guidance. So if anyone is interested in involving themselves in that, or got some ideas of that particular guidance document or any others, I'm very pleased to hear from you. And obviously in the course of drawing them up, it's always good to have some feedbacks of the draft versions. If anyone's got any comments about technical guidance, let me know now if you wish, or later. But otherwise, we'll move on.
Colin, I noticed you've added a proposed one there, number 7.
Yes, well, that was the proposed, which is the life disposable and recycling document.
Yes. Has anyone got any comments on that? Okay.
We also do, I just sort of a brief update of what we're doing, particularly at ITCO. We have a number of members and industry question and answers. They come through regularly, most weeks, about all various subjects about repairs, testing, regulations, lifting, and so on. Well, lifting with slings, that's just one recent one, filling and non-regulated cargoes and drums and so forth. So, you know, that's another thing that if you need any to discuss anything that comes up in your sort of daily job life, you're welcome to contact me. And on the regulation front, we're quite active on that, both in all of the regulations that affect tank containers, the UN, IMDG, RID, and so on. I'm constantly monitoring the different papers that are coming through and participating in most of the meetings. Of late, the meetings have been virtual meetings. And surprisingly, on such large meetings that go on for 2 or 3 days, they seem to be very efficient. And I sometimes wonder whether they'll ever go back to these large meetings that we were having previously in Geneva and Bern and so forth. But nevertheless, the meetings are continuing. There is a regulatory process, and it's a long process as such, because it starts with papers being submitted, sometimes only information papers to gauge guidance or gauge people's opinion, and then there becomes the regulatory paper. And then there will be a meeting about the paper, and normally the item has been then postponed to the next meeting. So it often goes on for a long period of time. And many of these processes are at first not such a bad thing for industry. They seem to be quite straightforward. But once you start into the discussion and once you start reading the paper in some detail, you realize that there's all manner of consequential problems, and the result of that is that ultimately it's cost. And I think most of us would all agree that if there's a regulatory process that improves safety in one way or the other, then that is worthwhile to pursue. But many of these papers are not really justified on any proven safety levels. They're almost a level of, I might say, a bit of tinkering and trying to keep one lobby group satisfied with what's going on. But what I do need, and what we do need as an industry, is to participate at the national level as well as the meeting level. And what I mean by that, and I've mentioned it before, is that each of the government, at these meetings, the only people that have a vote are the government representatives. They refer to them as the experts. And the experts vote, and the people such as ITCO, which are NGOs or non-governmental organizations, can make comments, can make papers, but they can't actually vote. Not that everything goes to a vote, but it generally goes to a consensus rather than an actual vote. But nevertheless, the important consensus really is around the government bodies. And most of those bodies have made up or have a decision process before they get to the meeting, because they have national level meetings. For example, in England, we have the Department of Environment, which deals, and they have a department which deals with dangerous goods. In other places, it's Department of Transport and so forth. So each government has some administrative process, and it's often necessary for to speak at the national level. So if you are in Belgium, for example, you're a Belgian registered company, and you can make contact with the Belgian authorities, then that is a bonus for us, because it gets onto the agreed agenda before they get to the meeting as such. So obviously governments are looking after the companies, or they should be looking after the companies within their country, and therefore they respond more to that than they might do at some of the meetings. So fortunately at the moment we don't have any well, we have one item that I'm going to speak about later on about inspection, but generally speaking, we don't have any major issues going on in the regulatory process at this particular time. But we should all keep together, and I know that many members are members of different organizations within their country, and it's good that we all liaise together and work together to make sure that consequential problems that cause costs and problems to industry are addressed.
So what you're saying is that we do have some power to not to influence the way that the regulations are being made, but it's got to be done through the national bodies.
Well, I like to think that there is some influence at the meeting itself, but but at the same time, you really need to, if I use this word, attack, as it were, on different levels. So on some subjects, it's very worthwhile to have the input in the pre-meetings, and whereas in the pre-meetings you can only attend a pre-meeting, which is at national level, if you're a company within that country. Yeah. Okay. So
okay, I've had one contact of someone asking about the where they can find all the technical guidance documents in the previous slide, one of the previous slides. And the answer is, if you haven't found the technical guidance documents, they are all on the website. They're under publications. I think some people weren't sure where they were being stored, but they're actually on two areas: the publications area and also the news area, because we put them down as a news item when they're published. But if
Patrick, can I ask one more question, Patrick?
Yeah. Go ahead, William.
Yeah, Colin, just going back to the technical documents you were referring to at the beginning, yeah, I think it would be a very good idea to have an official ITCO guidance on the end-of-life disposal of tank containers, and that could be then something we could, we as operators who have tanks coming to the end of their life could hand over to our partners, the scrap metal recyclers or whatever, because one of the things we have been campaigning about is that flexi tank shippers and suppliers, they have no stewardship over how their equipment is disposed of at the end of the flexi tank's journey. Nobody really knows what happens to it. So I think that in order to be consistent, it's a really good idea that we can raise standards around the metal recycling industry by just being able to hand over such a document to them. So I think I would really support that. And the second matter, if I could quickly say, is that you mentioned lifting with slings earlier on. I think that this is something which is becoming increasingly relevant, because we see a lot of chemical factories, they use ISO tanks for long-term storage, which of course long-term, I say several months. We of course very much encourage that as ISO tank providers, but quite often they don't have container lifting equipment in their factories, so they call in a crane just for one day to lift these containers off. And quite often, I'm not really sure that's being done very properly, and there is potential damage to the frame as a result of that, lifting a laden tank with just cables slung from the top of a wheeled crane. So I think it can be a very good idea if we were to produce some guidance about that, lifting containers not with proper container lifting equipment. How would you see that?
Well, yes, of course. I mean, I just mentioned that because these are just recent questions that people have asked, or in the last period anyway. And I just made it as an example. But you're right. There are issues about lifting with slings. If you don't get the right angle of sling, and containers are not all containers or all tanks are designed for lifting with slings. According to the ISO regulations. So yes, I think that would be a useful thing to do, and we make a note of that, and we'll see if I work some guidance on it too.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so right. So I mean, I'd say talk about regulatory participation. I just give an example here of the last meeting, actually the last meeting in September, October this year, September. Really, but there was a proposal for reinforcement plates to attachments to the tank shell. And the reason for that requirement was to what they suggest is to stop tearing of the tank shell. The problem comes with when these relatively small things come along, is that the tanks are designed for attachments, excuse me, and once you start doing that, you start thinking, what are attachments? There are attachments, say, the walkway to the frame or to the tank. Then there are cladding to the tank, and there is the actual collar that goes around the tank, which is also an attachment. Now, the way that the proposal really wasn't about the way that the tank was attached to the shell, or indeed about the cladding, but the way it was written or drafted, then there could have been these unintended consequences, and therefore it becomes what was a relatively small item becomes a possible problem in the future. And so we had an ITCO alternative paper, and there was quite a long debate about the item. And instead of the requirement for reinforcements plates being fixed to the shell, and there's quite a lot of them when you actually look at all the attachments, it was changed into welded elements shall be attached to the shell in such a way that tearing is prevented. That means that the designer has the option of the tank has an option to actually design it so that that won't happen, rather than it being prescriptive in the regulations. And that indeed is what regulations should be. They should actually set out what you want to achieve and leave the designer to achieve it in whatever way they feel appropriate. And of course, these items about reinforcement plates attached to the shell are very old-fashioned things from the rail industry and all industry from the past. But nowadays, of course, all the designs are checked, and they have finite element analysis, they have computer designs. Then some of these things that were put on just in case aren't necessary. So in a way, I just give this as an example of where the participation can pay benefits for participation in the process can be a benefit to ITCO and obviously to its members or ITCO members. Okay. Often in the newsletter, I refer a lot to ADR because there's a lot goes on at ADR and RID. And I'm sure sometimes many of you will think that, what does it really matter, because I'm only using UN portable tanks in international service, I'm not involved in ADR. Well, one of the reasons is that all of the government people that go to the RID ADR meetings are the same, or mostly the same people that go to IMDG meetings, or specifically the UN meeting and sometimes IMDG. So anything that actually happens at that area in the ADR, RDR, RID ADR, often finds its way into the UN, and then the same people are discussing it, or they may even be proposing it. And as a consequence, it then becomes part of the IMDG. So it's relevant in the sense that if you're running ADR tanks, it's obviously relevant, but it's also relevant because it will probably find itself into the UN meeting, which is ultimately the IMDG, next year or the year after that. So there are two things going on the inspection front at the moment. And this is probably the biggest thing that's going on in the regularity circle, and it has a big impact on ITCO members. The first thing is that there have been a number of inspection work groups. These are ADR inspection work groups, and we're on the 14th one at the moment, and they go on for a long period. And the net result of it is a tightening up of inspections. I mean, I'm now referring to the authorized inspection bodies, AIBs, who are carrying out periodic inspections and factory inspections. And there's been a general tightening up of those procedures. Now, we had a number of discussions within the tank working group. I'm now talking the ITCO tank working group. We've had some calls and discussions about new things that are coming along, making procedures for modifications for the way that testing is being done. All of these things are being tightened up on. In actual fact, when you really get into it, they're not actually changes, they're just literally that. They are a more tightening up of the regulations. And I'm not suggesting that they weren't necessarily following these things before in the past. It's just that they weren't following them through in a very specific way. So whereas the regulation says you will check the original type approval certificate, then the AIBs would have other ways of doing that. They can look at the tank, look at the data plate, they can, there's various ways that they can do that job. But now all of a sudden, they're actually asking for that original certificate. So in other words, it becomes a far more procedural and one might argue more bureaucratic way of doing exactly the same thing. But nevertheless, there is a tightening up. There are three things that are happening at the inspection work group. One is called accreditation of AIBs. These are authorized inspection bodies, people such as Lloyd's, BV, ABS, Silver Sims, all these companies that do the inspections. And what's happening at the moment is that most of them, well, all of them, of course, are accredited by at least one country. Let's say they're accredited in Belgium or England or United Kingdom or wherever, Germany, and they use that accreditation to do inspections in all other countries. And that's been the way for many years, and there's essentially reciprocal agreements. Under the new rules that they're trying to discuss at the moment is that the accreditation has to be done by the country that you do the inspection in. So in theory, this won't actually happen, but in theory, an AIB may have to be accredited in 10 different countries, let's say, which obviously is a big burden on them because the accreditation process is quite thorough, very procedural. They have to have all their documents and so on. And all these things add to the cost because ultimately they have to do that. Now, there may be some reciprocal agreements between one country and the other, so therefore they will be able to do that inspection. But if this goes through in the way, and I hasten to say it hasn't been finally agreed, but it seems to be the way that people want it to be, is at the meetings anyway, is that it may be very difficult to find one company that can do all inspections in anywhere in Europe. As there has been in the past. Now, some of the bigger ones may get way around that, and they may have some reciprocal agreements between, say, the Netherlands and Belgium, for example. But it just simply makes things much more difficult in the future. So I'm obviously speaking against that, trying to think of the difficulties that will cause to the tank container industry. I should mention also that part of this is about road tankers, and road tankers, have, it's not such a big issue for road tankers, but by and large they are in one country. I mean, they might travel to other countries, but they're normally based in one country and they go back and forth. And the regulations are RAD regulations, ADR regulations. They lump together road tankers and tank containers and indeed rail tanks all on the same chapter, all on chapter 6.8. So if you have what is happening at the moment, a relatively or potentially useful situation for a road tank, then it becomes because they want to harmonize, then it becomes an imposition on the tank container. And what I would like them to do is to actually do it if it's necessary for road tankers, and there seems to be good reasons for road tankers because often they are built specifically for a country, whereas a tank container is international and certainly in the case of ADR, international throughout Europe. So then they don't have the same issues that you have as a road tanker. For example, they don't have a chassis, they don't have wheels, they don't have brakes, they don't have lighting, all these things that are part of the issues that are coming up. So we would like to have some dispensation not to include tank containers in these rules, but I think that is likely to be that they will be so.
It seems a bit surprising, Colin, that they're putting tank containers together with rail tank cars and road tankers and so on. It seems
well,
naive,
you're right, but of course it's always been like that from day one, and I agree with you. Yes, it doesn't make real sense, but
no, it is.
this is how it is, and they're not. That's not going to change. That's for sure. But yeah, it doesn't make much sense. And the next issue that's coming up is the country of registration. Now, this is also very difficult for tank containers. At the moment, if you are manufacturing containers in wherever, in Europe or in South Africa, China, the manufacturer manufactures them. You choose an inspection body that's active in that area, and the inspection's carried out. But now, under the new rule that they're trying to push forward, is that the inspection body has to be recognized by the country where the container owner or container owner or operator is registered. So what that means is that if you are a manufacturer, if you are a tank operator and you're buying, say, tanks, and you're registered in Belgium, then providing that you have a country, an AIB that's registered or approved or recognised by Belgium, then that's perfectly okay. If you are maybe a lease company and you are manufacturing tanks, but you don't know where they're actually going to, because let's say you're building swap bodies for Europe, and you're building, let's say, 100 of them, you may not know where they're actually going to. Therefore, you may have them inspected by a country, an AIB that's not actually registered in one of the countries where the potential lessee is. So again, this doesn't, it works quite well for road tankers, but it can be a real burden for a tank container operator or tank container lessor. So another point that we're trying to speak about. And then the third item that's part of this, it's quite a long meeting and there's a lot of items going on in this inspection work group. But the third item that I've sort of picked out is this entry into service verification. This is a new thing that doesn't happen at the moment. So what it amounts to is if you are building the tank container in somewhere, say South Africa, and it arrives in Europe, then it has to be inspected in the country of the operator that's going to use it. And if it's a lease container, and after it's been on lease, it moves to another operator who's in another country, then it would have another inspection, entry into service. So again, this is something I've been speaking about at the meetings and written about, and with a paper jointly with Belgium. I'm advising them really that this entry into service is going to be extremely burdensome and indeed unnecessary for tank containers. So you would often have a situation under these rules where a container that comes from the factory arrives in, let's say, Rotterdam on a one-way move, or one-way empty into Rotterdam. But let's say the operator is registered in Belgium. The theory of this is that you then have to move it to Belgium in order that it can actually have an entry into service verification. Now, I use an extreme example there because I'm sure there will be a reciprocal agreement between these two bodies. But I use it just to emphasize what this actually means. So a burden that the industry can do without. And then, of course, you've got other issues about country of registration, where this supposes that each state, each country, has a register of all the operators in their region, which, of course, for tank containers would not be the case, whereas for road tankers it may be. So there are a lot of issues coming on at this meeting, well, it's after this, if you feel, I've written about this many times in the newsletter, but there's very little feedback. But if you feel strongly about it, what we could do is with a number of operators, a number of lease companies, or particularly speaking directly to the country where they are actually registered. If they're registered in Europe, I hasten to add. So has anybody got any thoughts on this ADR inspection? And
Colin, I think Laurie McLaughlin would like to say a couple of words.
Yeah, hello, Colin. One of the points I just want to raise is with regard to the additional regulation for tank containers, and that is with accreditation and registration. One point you can make to the authorities is that they're further extending the uneven playing field opposite plastic bags, and by implication they're supporting further waste plastic, because bags at the moment are anonymous and unregulated, and yet tanks are already heavily regulated, and indeed they're imposing more regulation on us, which is pushing people towards the use of plastic bags, which is not in the interests of either the environment or the industry.
Yes, well, I agree with you. On the environmental issues have been raised a number of times, and I have raised them a number of times, because purely for not really about not tacking onto flexi tanks, but the idea that you are actually moving containers empty to another place in order that they can be inspected is obviously an environmental problem, because you're physically moving a tank from Holland to Rotterdam to Hamburg just so that it can be inspected in that country, and obviously that's an environmental thing. But I will also take on the point about the flexi tank as well.
Yeah, I mean, not only are they increasing the carbon footprint by increasing the journey, but they're pushing users towards using unregulated forms, which is just not acceptable.
Exactly, yeah.
Thanks, Colin.
Colin?
Yes.
Dennis from Hoyer, do you know by any chance who is part of the inspection body working group?
Well, I do. There's probably I can't remember the number, but there's about 30 odd different countries. But I can certainly give you the list of those people. Yes.
Okay, would be interesting to see.
Yeah, I think you'll find that almost every European country has a representative in that group. I mean, it tends to be in that all the countries have when I say all of the people that are active, I mean, it tends to be the countries such as, Germany, Netherlands, United Kingdom, Sweden, all these countries. It tends not to be some of the more outlying ones, but normally there's somebody representing all of them there. And I can certainly give you the list of those people.
There's a
And
reason why
I've been on that working group for some time
Mm.
and taking part. And Jim Silver, who's obviously Silver Sims, he has also been taking part for a long period of time. Not at the same time as me, but we're alternating a bit.
there's a reason why I'm asking as well, because when I look now what's happening to the AIBs worldwide, I'm missing really focus on tank container industry. And I think all of us have seen mergers, takeovers recently in Holland, wherever you look at it. And if I look who really has the focus on tank containers, I miss their focus on tank containers. And
Yeah.
that's what you see when you see regulations. Where's the focus on tank containers, which is our industry?
Precisely, and that's really the point that we make, because particularly in ADR and RAD, as you know, the tank containers and road tankers are in different columns, so you can actually have a regulation that applies to a tank container that doesn't apply to a road tanker, and vice versa. But that is really what I'm trying to encourage them to do what they need to do for a road tanker, but don't impose those same things on a tank container unless you can actually justify it in some form of reason for safety or whatever, not just simply a matter of tidying up the regulations for so it looks pretty. Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Colin, this is Raj. I would basically go in the shadow of Hans as well, and would say as well, I would highly appreciate to see this list in order that we can step forward as well to our guy, which take part at the group in these regards. But all overseeing this is, in any case, we need to make sure that this is not going to happen. This tied up of the regulations is unnecessarily. It is not needed. There is no case ever or evident that we have to do it. I think our service and maintenance plan works perfectly, and I'm not going to do a preparation speech now for the whole tank container industry. All of us are known that. All of us are basically living out of it, I would say, and we know even that we have the best containment basically for liquids if it comes to intermodal transport, which is quite clear, and that's what we have to bring into. And what I have to say as well, I'm as well agree that if you are loading up the regulations on the tank container side, which just gives a push then basically to the plastic bags, to the flexis in particular in this case as well, because the situation will be even more different in this case, and even more in favor of the flexis. We have to make clear that those fellows to understand what they are going to do if they would apply those rules to us, and that would be a huge thing. And we have as well issues then with lead time on the workshops. We are basically then being in a monopoly of these country and of those workshops as well, and that makes it very difficult as well. It's everything what we don't want is now on the table, I would say. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Well, as I mentioned, I will let you have the names of the people to contact. The important thing is that we all liaise together, so we're actually sending the same message. And then after this meeting, I will do that. Okay. Next one. The other thing that's coming up at the 2.5 year intermediate test. If one reads in regulations at the moment, you are allowed to do an intermediate test 90 days pre and 90 days post. And of course, on that basis, what do you do after 90 days? Because the regulation says you can only do an intermediate test 90 days pre and 90 days post. Now, what has happened is a little bit about tightening up on regulations, is that on procedures is that, sometimes if it was 91 days or 95 days or 100 days, perhaps you would then carry on doing a 2.5-year inspection. But if you are now an AIB that is working to a far more rigid accreditation system, then you have to read the regulations, and it says you can only do it between 90 and 90 days after. So therefore, if it's 91 days, then you have to move on to a 5-year test or a periodic test. So this is something that's going through, and there's much discussion about that, and probably the rail industry is very reluctant to agree this. And it's been discussed at 2 meetings or 3 now, 2, yes, 2, and it's now been deferred to the next meeting. So again, that is something that we have to, if you want to do 2.5-year inspections soon after the 90 days, we have to lobby, as it were, the national bodies as well as speaking out at the meetings. So that's another thing that's coming through, and it will be a proposal essentially that says that after 90 days it has to be a 5-year inspection. What we'd like to do is to continue the current norm to allows people to carry on. It's more important, I think, with an RID inspection, ADR R&D, because it doesn't require you to do necessarily an internal inspection in the same way as it does for UN portables. And then there is obviously sometimes an economic reason that you might want to do a 5-year inspection after 90 days, because that way you, to all intents, reset the clock, and you've got 2.5 years before the next one. So there's not always a lot of logic, let's say, doing a 2.5-year inspection at 4 years, because you'd have to do another 1 year later. But nevertheless, there has to be a cutoff, and at the moment it's 90 days, and the debate is what happens after 90 days. Okay.
I mean, I like to step in on that point as well. In my opinion, it does not make really sense to do a 5-year test in these regards, because the 5-year test goes from the 0 line, which is the baseline, basically, and then it counts 5 years. It has nothing to do basically with the 2.5-year test. As far as I have understood the regulation, and as far that we are doing the whole thing as well, and as far as PV and TNV and all these guys are doing the whole thing as well. So we have to say that has nothing to do, and it is simple, a matter of fact. If you come along in this period of time and you're going to do it with these 90 days, then at least you can count on the same date as it was supposed to do the 2.5-year test. But if you're coming before the 90 days and you carry out the 2.5-year test, then you're going to stop basically after 4.5 years, let's say this ways, and you have a half a year which is not covered in these regards for the 5-year test. Then you have to come along further or earlier in this point. I mean, yes, you're right. We need to stay as well on that one. There is as well no reason to change anything on that, because there is not even one case which simply says they just have to be, which says we have an issue or a problem on that. They just need to basically carry out as it is written in the regulation at the moment in time. Over-regulation does not make things better, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, I think we need to have some flexibility, but you have to not lose sight of the fact that the current regulation does require you to do that. I mean, actually, you could even argue that this is not a change, because the regulation says you have to do it within that 90 or that 90-day pre and post period. In other words, you've got that period to do it in, and therefore it's about, at the moment, the regulation is probably being relaxed in such a way or made more practical, and now they're talking about making it more prescriptive. But this is ongoing still. This again is not something that's happened, it's something we're working on. Okay, so we've got someone other.
Colin, there's a comment, I don't know if you can see it, but about the 90-day rule. I don't know if you can see it on the chat line.
Yeah, well, again, it's what you can say is that there are obviously a lot of people at the meetings, and a lot of people have different views on what it actually means. But the debate at the moment is that it means that that they want to have moving on to a 5-year inspection. I mean, they often using examples of tanks that have been used for static storage for long periods of time, and there's various reasons for it. But I don't think that we're bound to talk about it. We're talking against it.
Okay, good. We move on to the next one.
I just mentioned the UN FRP tank working group. These are the composite tanks that are going through. The working group has been working on this for probably 2 years now, maybe 3. Ultimately, what there will be is a new chapter 6.9, because in the IMDG and UN, tank container construction is under stainless steel or metallic construction is under 6.7. There will be a new 6.9, which allows you to use the composite tanks. There will be new T instructions for each of the tank working tank code for each of the FRP different designs. And it will mean that an FRP tank will be able to use effectively in the same way as you use a stainless steel tank or a metal tank, according to the regulations and the T code and so forth. There's much discussion at the moment on the liners that go in the FRP tanks, because there are different types of liners of FRP tanks are made up of 3 layers: an internal liner, a structural layer, and an external layer, all bonded together, of course. And the internal liner is a barrier against chemical resistance. And that internal liner can be FRP, it can be thermoplastic, and it can be metallic. So there's much discussion about that particular part of the regulations. But I think the final version of this this document will probably be put forward to the session in next year. It's going to be discussed. There's a meeting in November, late November, December, and then the draft will be offered. But probably a final version will probably maybe make the mid-year to 2021. It may not, it may be November, anything could happen, but at the moment probably. And a consequence of that is that it may be discussed at IMDG and eventually maybe in the 2024 edition of IMDG. But again, they haven't finished the draft, and we don't know how long it'll be discussed, and there is no real knowing of how long it will be, but it's certainly going to be another 4 years, I would suggest. And then after that, once the draft is finished, I mean, say next year, let's say the draft is finished next year, then the draft for liquefied gas will start. At the moment, we're only dealing with FRP tanks for liquids, but obviously for gas it will be quite a big game changer, because FRP tanks are much lighter, and therefore the gas tank will be considerably lighter, and that would be quite a big process. But these are ongoing at the work groups.
Okay. Any points on that slide?
Okay, if there's nothing, comment on that. Another small thing that's going on, IMDG is not very active at the moment in terms of tank containers. On many other fronts they are, but by good fortune, the portable tanks do not feature highly. But I just mentioned IMDG process about data loggers, or the telemetrics for tanks. And the discussion was about what they refer to as a certified tank type. And there is a design criteria for these data loggers, and creating an ISO standard too. So at some point, when the next IMDG meeting meeting will take place. It would have been last month in September, but it was postponed. One of the papers coming up on that is to agree on what we refer to as a certified tank safe type for loggers. I mention it here simply because companies, and particularly nowadays, that are getting involved in fitting telemetrics to tanks, it's probably worthwhile to double check that what you're fitting meets the requirement for the certified safe type. I think you'll find most of them will, but it's always a good thing to check. It was agreed at IMDG that for tank containers, they should meet zone 1. For dry freight, I think it was for zone 2, and so on. So they have different data logger certified tank types depending on the zone they're in. So again, this is to be discussed. It's not been actually finalized or agreed, but if you are fitting them, it's probably good practice to check that they meet those requirements for the certified safe type. Okay, next one. Have we got any more? At ISO level, I have some involvement in ISO, but at the moment there's very little going on in the tank container side. As you perhaps know, the 1496, which is about the specification and testing of tank containers, was finished last year. So that's been updated from the previous 1995 version, I think it was. Currently, there's part 4 is being worked on, which is about centrally non-pressurized containers for dry bulk. So it's really not a tank container issue particularly, although it has some sort of similarities in many cases. And there will be a new amendment to 6346. This is 6346 is the ISO for marking of containers for all container types, including tanks. So this would be, it refers to the prefix and the ISO codes and all these other matters. And on the new amendment, which hasn't been finally put through, but it will probably be called the 2020 version because it's coming through the voting system of ISO at the moment. There are some other changes, and one of them that will apply to tank containers, or at least it applies to over widths like swap bodies, where there has to be a marking on the front and the rear, as shown on the screen here, being like a big arrow, the width of the container. So that is a new requirement, or will be a new requirement for marking of over width tanks. It applies to new manufacture rather than existing ones, but sometimes these things end up falling over, moving into the existing too. But at the moment, it only applies to new manufacture. So that will be something that will probably come in the 2020 version, and I'm not sure when the release date is, but it's going to be probably early 2021.
Colin, just going back to the previous slide, I can. There was someone asking for a clarification on tank zones. Back to the previous slide.
Sorry, previous.
On the previous slide, but clarification on the zones. I think the zones there.
Okay, well, what the certified tank type, certified safe type applies to all containers, refrigerated containers, dry freight, tanks, any other type of container. And in the proposal, the proposal is that for tank containers, as a standard, they would require to meet zone 1. And these are recognized zones. These zones have been part of explosive environments for many, many years. So this is not new. But what is being proposed at IMDG is that zone 1 would apply to a tank container, and therefore the telemetrics or the electronic devices would have to meet the requirements for zone 1.
Very good, thank you.
So just a bit of an update on the next regulatory sessions. The UN Transport Dangerous Goods, and this is the one that's including the FRP tanks, is December. It seems at the moment they think it might be a live meeting, but I suspect it's going to be a virtual meeting. The ADR inspection meeting is in December, which I will attend, and the IMO, IMDG, I'm not sure, that was in September this year, but it was postponed to next year. There was some discussion that may be in the spring, but probably it will end up being next September. Again, that hasn't been confirmed when that next meeting is. And the RID ADR next meeting will be spring. So if at that working group, the one that I referred to in December, if any decision or any papers that presented to that working group or as a result of that working group will presented to the RID meeting in spring, and it may be then postponed to the next meeting and so on. So but at the moment the AID working group in December will discuss and make some decisions, but it won't actually be presented to the regulations until next year. Okay, and just as a reminder of these new additions, the IMDG code is almost out now, the 2021 version. Or actually, there's a mistake on there, IMD 2021, and then there's the RID 2021 version, which is available now if anyone requires it. I think on the IMDG, the digital version is available, but the hard copy is it appears, I was just checking before I did this slide, there is no actual date, but it's likely to be in 2021. That's been delayed, but the digital version is available now. And for anybody who hasn't used the digital version, I mean, I would recommend it. I find it quite useful to have the digital one because it's on, you can obviously use it from the internet directly. You have to buy it, of course, but it's still available. Okay, I think thank you very much for your attention. I hope it was something informative, but if you have any points to make or comments or discussions, you're very welcome to take them now.
Thank you, Colin. Yes, that was really great. Yeah, this presentation will be made available afterwards, but if anyone's got any comments now, now's a good time to do it.
Okay, well, we're looking at...
Can I step in? Okay,
Yes,
Colin,
sure.
one question from my side, clear and straight. What would you recommend to do as ITCO in order to stay strong against these new requirements which are come along from the AIB, for example, in regards to that, which we all know that is basically nuts for us, which drives us really crazy if that would come, I mean, it sounds to me kind of really, really strange to bring the container back to a certain country just to do the test if we're standing next to another facility which would be been able to carry out the test. It does not really make sense to me. So once again, as ITCO, as Colin, what would you do? What would be the best approach for us to do it? To reunion us together as one force, basically as one strike against this change.
Well, I think that obviously the first thing is to continue for ITCO in the being involved in the regulatory process. I mean, that's the most important thing. The second is to create a procedure where interested parties such as yourself contact their government department about these issues that we're talking about. And obviously, as part of being part of this process, you have some sort of a say at the regulatory meeting, but not everybody has the same opinion, of course, and you just have to try and to do what we do. But always, as with all of these things, is that it sounds quite draconian at this stage, the way it's being, the way I've explained it. And maybe if these things do come through, there may be some more practical ways of dealing with it. And, you know, as with all regulations, sometimes not everything is followed exactly to the letter. But so you could pretty much argue that I'm giving you the worst case. But on the other hand, that is the case that's being put forward in a regulatory form. So I think the important thing is that we all work together and try and make these approaches from more than one country, because that is good for influence. And we, you know, and we try to explain that to our own national body.
So do I get you right? You're going to unite us basically to one team, and then we're going to send to all of them the same letter, each one to his own country, a representative of his own country, or how, you know what I mean? You know,
Yeah,
practically, I ask you practically what we are going to do in
Yeah.
order to do that, you know, because I think
well,
one alone cannot do it.
Yeah, what you say is correct, and that's what we would like to do. I have to say that, you know, I've been discussing this at various meetings and mentioned it many times, and the general engagement of everybody in these matters generally happens sort of after the event when these regulations have come through. But we do need to work together, and then I will again make a draft, as it were, and send it around to anyone who's interested to get involved in the regulatory process, such as yourself.
So basically, it's creating a structure in which everyone can communicate with their national authorities, but maybe having it in a unified approach.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Roger. Any other points people would like to raise about that or any of the other items? Let's say the presentation will be made available afterwards.
Okay, then. Well, looks like we've did very well on the timing.
Perfect timing.
2 minutes past 12.
Just before we close, Colin, I think ITCO President Reg Lee's on the line. He'd like just to say a couple of closing comments. Reg,
Thank you, Patrick. Can you hear me okay?
Me fine.
Fine, because my arrangements with computers are not very good. First of all, I'd like to thank Patrick and Colin for arranging this webinar. I'd also like to remind all our members, as well as our guests here, that Colin Rubery, the person who wrote the ITCO e-learning course, which of course has now been accepted as the industry standard. During this work down, we've seen many companies use this as a tool to introduce new staff and remind their own staff of the conditions. In fact, 2 or maybe 3 of these e-learning courses, and they're saying that it's now mandatory inside their company that anybody joining the company must first of all read and do this e-learning course. So I just opportunity when we had enough members together to thank Colin personally for the effort and time he's put into this. And unfortunately, it's an ongoing business because it has to be updated. So once again, Colin, well done and thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I wanted to thank you all for taking part in this webinar. It's for me very difficult computers. I normally get my grandchildren to do it. But I'd like to pass it back to Patrick, if I may now. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Reg. Much appreciated. And yes, Colin's done a lot of work behind the scenes, not just on this presentation, but attending a lot of the different meetings. Some of them last for 4 or 5 days at a time. So it's a very dedicated person who takes the time to do that. Okay, well, I think we'll conclude the webinar today. And just as mentioned at the beginning of the session, this is the second in a series of webinars. The next one's going to be next month in November, and we're going to be focusing on safety. So I'll be sending out information about that in the coming days. We look forward to speaking to you then. And in the meantime, have a good day. Thanks for participating and goodbye for now.
Okay, goodbye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks all.